Russell and Emily had been married for 6 years. She was a nail technician while he worked as a landscape designer at Asmall firm 2 years prior. They'd purchased an apartment with a mortgage and had been slowly fixing it up more. Then a year ago they decided they were finally ready to have a child. Both of them longed to become parents, but for some reason it just never happened. Even after all their tests came back normal, they refused to take any radical steps, so they just kept hoping that one day, luck would be on their side. Russell had a close friend, Andrew, who was basically the opposite of him in terms of relationships. Andrew was single and lived alone. He had little luck in love, and eventually stopped trying to make it happen, figuring he was fine on his own. The two friends had known each other since middle school and stayed in touch through adulthood, even though thought they didn't see each other that often. But whenever they did manage to get together, it was like no time had passed at all. One day Andrew was out running errands and decided to cut through a park. His mind was on the renovations. He'd started in his own place, so he was barely aware of the other people strolling by. Suddenly he tripped on a rock in the middle of the path, snapping him. Out of his thoughts, glancing around to see if anyone had noticed him stumble, he spotted a familiar silhouette. Up ahead when he got closer, cognized her. It was Emily, Russell's wife, and she wasn't alone. Some man walked beside her. Emily. "Hey," Andrew called, out, stepping closer. "Oh," she turned. Andrew, "Hi, wow, I didn't expect to see you here." Andrew extended his hand to Emily's companion. "Andrew." He introduced himself. "Chris," the man replied. At that moment, Emily seemed a bit tense. She bit her lip, then let out a little laugh. "This is my brother. He's just in town for the day. I'm showing him around. Actually, we're kind of in a hurry, sorry." Andrew said it was no problem and asked her to say he to Russell for him. They parted ways, but Andrew couldn't help noticing the way Emily acted, like she was nervous or hiding something. He had a fleeting suspicion that these two were more than brother and sister, but his phone rang with a client call, so his mind quickly shifted elsewhere in the rush of daily life. Andrew forgot about that scene in the park. It never even crossed his mind that Russell never called him afterward. Usually, if Andrew asked someone to say hi to Russell, Russell would respond by inviting Andrew to hang out this time. It was radio silence months later, though. Russell finally reached out one evening. He called Andrew, his voice excited. "Dude, you won't believe it. I'm actually going to be a dad." Andrew wholeheartedly congratulated him, knowing how long the couple had been waiting for it. Later that year in the winter, Russell invited Andrew to come celebrate when Emily and the baby were released from the hospital. They had a small get-together to mark the occasion. After that, Andrew didn't hear much. Russell and Emily were completely wrapped up in caring for the baby, and Russell especially was throwing himself into work to provide for his new family. More time went by without them seeing each other in person, just the occasional text message. Then one day Andrew found himself in Russell's neighborhood. On a weekend, he needed to pick up an online order from a store located right inside the building where Russell lived. By a happy coincidence, he bumped into Russell outside, who was strolling with a baby carriage. Andrew called out to him, and Russell put a finger to his lips, signaling that the baby was dozing. Turned out Emily had sent Russell out with their son, while she stayed behind to rest. Andrew and Russell chatted, and Andrew couldn't help smiling at the little boy. "So do you think it takes after you or Emily? He's all his mom, man." Russell joked. "Looks like he decided he didn't want any of my features." Andrew didn't laugh. Instead, he thought back to that day in the park, remembering Emily with that mysterious man she called her brother just a little while before the big pregnancy announcement. So Andrew decided to ask, "Look, I hope you don't take this the wrong way, but did it ever cross your mind that the baby might not be yours?" Russell stared at him like Andrew had gone crazy. Then he laughed in disbelief. "And why would I think that?" Andrew took a deep breath and told Russell what he'd seen in the park that day. Russell's face grew serious. "Well, she never mentioned running into you or passing on that hello you gave me, for that matter, and a brother named Chris. Emily has no real brother by that name. I don't remember any cousin named Chris either, and she sure never said anything about a relative visiting around that time that put a big crack in Russell's world. He'd been on cloud and finally having a son, his little heir, Ash he'd called him. He'd always believed he and Emily had a solid marriage, but now There was this creeping doubt about whether the child was even his they'd struggled to conceive. For so long, then bam, Emily got pregnant out of nowhere. He'd called it a miracle now. He wasn't so sure. He thanked Andrew for telling him. Even though it was months after the fact that evening, Russell waited anxiously for his wife to return home. He sat in tense silence at the kitchen table, running through every suspicious detail that in hindsight might have hinted at something. He thought of how Emily had seemed distant after their repeated failed attempts at pregnancy. He'd chalked it up to stress or hormone issues. Now he wondered if she'd simply drifted from him. Russell decided to call his mother-in-law, hoping to figure out if Emily actually had any brother or cousin named Chris. He made up some excuse. Maybe Chris had dropped by the apartment looking for Emily, and sure enough, his mother-in-law confirmed no such relative existed. Just as he ended the call, Emily came home. She checked on the baby, and Russell decided it was time for a serious talk. He started by mentioning Chris, who supposedly had shown up claiming to be her guest. He studied her face closely. She avoided his eyes, her gaze darting around. She tensed at the name but tried to play it off. "Yeah, he was an old co-worker," she said. "What did he want from me?" "Wanted to see his kid." Russell replied, going straight for the jugular. Emily's face went white, and for a moment she just stared at him, opening and closing her mouth like a fish out of water. Russell pressed harder. "So is he telling the truth or not? Did you cheat me with him? I think it's time for a paternity test." His words landed like thunder. Emily tried to regain her composure, then flared up in anger after. "I spent hours in labor to give you a son. You have the nerve to. If he's actually my son, why are you so upset?" Russell said calmly. She looked like she was about to explode with rage for getting their sleeping baby. She started shouting that Russell was acting like a coward, shirking responsibility for his child. She threatened to pack up and leave, never to return. With tears in her eyes, she began tossing clothes into a suitcase. A test eventually confirmed the child wasn't. Russell, enraged and devastated because he'd truly grown to love that little boy, he filed for divorce. Andrew stood by him the whole time, helping him navigate his heartache. Emily moved in with her parents. She'd already split from her lover Chris a while back, but in her vulnerable state she tried reaching out to him again. However, Chris had a family of his own, now no interest in reconnecting, and so be lying to her husband. Emily ended up losing everything. Her plan backfired, and she was the one left with nothing.